such as E.W. Godwin, whose influence is very much felt in this very sort of rectilinear, spindly, and no doubt ebonized, that is to say black furniture shown here. Oh, and I wanted to tell you that the furniture is inspired by Godwin, who's British. The drawing is drawn by Alexander Sandier, a French designer working for Christian Herder, who is in fact himself a German. So that combination in itself tells you how cosmopolitan things have become. This is one of the great interiors of around 1880 in the aesthetic style that Herder Brothers did for clients. This is Oliver Ames's house at 355 Commonwealth Avenue. I think the building still exists. And it was characterized by an ivory and gold palette, but now tempered by overall patterning, which is the hallmark of one of the hallmarks of the aesthetic style, small, abstract, decorative patterning that creates a sort of overall unifying element in the room. Gratefully, we were recently given the vitrine on the right, which came to light in a small Boston auction, miscategorized as Edwardian cabinet, purchased by a famous New York dealer for a mere $15,000. She knew what it was, and so did I, but I knew she'd get there first, and eventually we got it as a gift, so that was good. Oh, well, and I wanted to say that this is also the era by about the early 80s, it's 80, 83, where electricity is coming into play. The photograph may actually be a little bit later, but the bare light bulb is being displayed as a decorative element in its own right. This is one of Herder Brothers' earliest case pieces in the aesthetic style for a house in Oswego, New York, very much following an English model, which we'll see momentarily, but it's ebonized, that's to say black. It's got these stylized marquetry panels. They're floral, they're recognizable, but they're no longer the literal naturalism which characterized the 1850s decoration that we looked at earlier. The painted panels may be by Christian Herder himself. And what they're following is this cabinet, this type of cabinet by Lamb of Manchester. Such cabinets with their mirrored backs and glass shelves, etc., were meant for display. These are parlor cabinets, and the idea is that you're going to collect objects of decorative art and display them in your drawing room. Likewise, this is a very famous chair by E.W. Godwin for Dromore Castle in Ireland. It's oak, it's leather covered, it's a husky dining room chair. But look what Christian Herder did with it in this model. A little light or reception chair, ebonized with, again, abstract floral marquetry, a small carved panel in the back, very rectilinear, all these turned elements, very delicate and very different. One would have to say, okay, there's the big idea, but this is really something else. This was made for Jay Gould's bedroom. It's a fall front secretary. We've seen one other of those today. But here again, it's ebonized cherry, cherry being a close-grained hardwood that takes that black surface very nicely. And this is one of the great outstanding examples of Herder Brothers' signature marquetry during the 1870s. The idea being that, and because I think so many architects were involved now in the interior decoration of the era, that surfaces had to be treated as surfaces. They had to be respected. And that anything literal or naturalistic was verboten. So you get these flat patterns. You never really break with nature, but it's flat overall surface decoration here. And that might focus a tad, that this urn in the center with this eruption of flowers, very much coming out of a Middle Eastern decorative vocabulary, the Near East being one of those areas of the world in which decorative art and abstract decoration was very much venerated, where literal, naturalistic or figurative decoration was verboten, literally. As well, there's a sort of connection to Japan in such black pieces. Japan had been closed to the West until the 1850s, and during the period of the 1860s, Japanese goods began to flood the West. Designers were fascinated by this. There's a whole new vocabulary they hadn't seen before, and it becomes very much part of the aesthetic of the 1870s in so-called Anglo-Japanese furniture, such as this. This is a great cabinet, again, one of those display cabinets from the Art Institute of Chicago by Herder Brothers, with gilded inset roundels and fabulous big-scale marquetry. These are a pair of chairs. A sweet little story came up in a Boston shop during the time of Herder Brothers. The man who sold one to the Met and one to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, which was our collaborator on the show, knew exactly what they were. These are little gilded Herder chairs from this period, and Lord knows if they'd been on the New York market, we would never have been able to buy one. They were made for D.O. Mills, one of the great railroad magnates who patronized Herder Brothers. All the great railroad magnates and risk takers, as I call them, tended to go to Herder Brothers, who were a little offbeat. There were other more conservative firms who catered to a more conservative clientele. But look at this divine little butterfly-shaped handhold, very much coming out of the Japanese aesthetic. This little low-relief carved necklace of blossoms and tendrils of ivy, the strung coin motifs going up the sides of the chair, the sort of back that is suspended by these two sort of parentheses-shaped frames on either side. In any case, really a little gem, and they didn't cost a fortune. It was so nice. The great, and I'm coming now to a conclusion, so if you can bear with me sort of for another 5 or so minutes, we'll be done. The great sort of capstone of Christian Herder's career was the William H. Vanderbilt house, which was built, and in this case it was unusual. Herder took responsibility for the entire house. He hired the architect, he did all of the interior decorations, supplied the furnishings, whether they were from his own shop or from elsewhere. I didn't bring you a picture of the exterior, but it did. The house was located at 51st and 5th Avenue, I think on the site of what is now Cartier, or across the street from what is now Cartier. In any case, it's long gone. William H. Vanderbilt, it was built between 79 and 83. Dear old William H. got to move in, and sadly died in 85. Eventually, his daughter-in-law proclaimed his house the Black Hole of Calcutta, and hired Horace Trumbauer to come in and gut it and make it into a white classical interior. See, these things keep swinging back and forth. And this is the stuff that we've loved to hate in the 20th century, but I would posit that really has a lot to do with the fact that we are ourselves products of the 20th century. The influence of modernism in the 20th century has been very cogent, and it has been a long time in coming that we can finally begin to look at the 19th century with any modicum of respect and interest. And that whole phenomenon is a relatively recent one, which is why it's really fun for me to be involved in this field at a place like the Met, which has a really great collection. And the reason we do is in no small measure due to the fact that in 1970 the Metropolitan Museum turned 100. And to celebrate that, the American Wing mounted a huge exhibition called 19th Century America. And it was a double-barreled show. Some of you may have been, before my time in New York, actually, but it was painting and sculpture. But the really revolutionary part was the decorative arts. And it dealt with the entire spectrum of decorative arts from the Federal period through the arts and crafts period, both furniture and others, ceramics, glass, etc., much of which became part of the permanent collection. And so I would say that it's really only since 1970, which then inspired people to start to look at the 19th century. We had a number of important exhibitions since then, of which I would say, and it sounds immodest, but I have to say it is true, Art in Empire City would be the most recent, because it was such a monumental undertaking. In any case, going back to William H. Vanderbilt, this house put poor old Christian Herder 6 feet under. He died of tuberculosis at the age of 44 in 1883. But here is a corner of the drawing room with its painted mural by Pierre Victor Galland, a decorative painter in Paris, with its Pompeian red velvet walls that were embroidered with gold and silver threads and bits of mirror and mother of pearl, with its gilded furniture, its luxurious fabrics and carpets and portieres, and decorative objects of all kinds. And one of the most famous pieces of furniture from that drawing room is a little gilded chair, of which, until very recently, only 2 were known. This one from the Carnegie, there's another in the High Museum, and interestingly, one came up at auction the other day in Norwalk, Connecticut, in a small estate sale. As has been the case every time 3 times these chairs have come up, the chair was once again cataloged as French. Why? Because if it's sophisticated, it cannot possibly be American, right? Wrong. I will say, too, I should add that all these things, Herder Brothers and the others, they're all incredibly well made, of the very best woods. And you compare this kind of thing to any little equivalent chair made in Paris at the same time, it's just head and tails above the French model, generally speaking, in terms of quality of construction and detail. But here it is, it's gilded, inset with mother of pearl. There are mother of pearl plaques at the corner of each leg, and then there's a big sort of drop element, which is actually a mosaic of mother of pearl, and probably abalone in this case, with carved bows and ribbons surrounding it. Like the little Davis chair that we looked at closely a while ago, this has legs that turn out sideways with little hoof feet, little delicate feet, which have a little sort of curl that carves around just above where the calf would be. There are mother of pearl discs inset into the stiles, the uprights of the chair, which just sort of sway out to frame that lovely sort of curved back. And there's a carved gilded snake, which actually two snakes, which curve in and out through the splat on the back. I mean, it's a real, all of these things are a little tour de force, if you will, of the carver's art. The upholstery is not original. And I'm pleased to say that the chair that came out the other day has its original gilding. It has all of its mother of pearl and perhaps the original cape or under upholstery. We have it at the Met now for study, and I will do my damnedest to make sure that it stays as part of our collection. We do have a kind of concentration of Herder Brothers in that we have about 20 pieces. One of which is a dining room chair from the William H. Vanderbilt house, and this is from a period photograph of that room, which would, I think, focus a little bit, was carved oak. As you can see, this is very typical. It's the kind of thing that in the 20th century we have loved to dislike about the 19th century. Those carved dark interiors, these chairs with their gilded leather upholstery. It's just, every time I think about all these houses that were built in New York and elsewhere that have been torn down and the fabulous materials that, probably just went into a dumpster. Every once in a while you see some of this paneling cropping up in somebody's apartment or, in a house in New Jersey, somebody who managed to be there and store it in the garage, but so much must have been lost. This is the chair that we have at the Met's collection from that room. The gilded leather upholstery is a recreation of what would have been on there. It's carved oak, and it's very typical of a dining room chair, like that Godwin did for Dromore Castle that we looked at a moment ago. It's oak and it's got leather, and that's easy to clean, and that's dining room chairs. And in this case, there's a little cornucopia, that theme of bounty recurring for the dining room. But on each of these chairs, and there are now about 8 of them that have come to light, it was a suite that would have had about 24, we think, based on the numbers that are carved into the frames. Each of those cornucopia is entirely different from the next. Then you get down to the bottom half of the chair, and I love to show this to European colleagues who gasp in surprise and say that they've never seen anything quite like it. And indeed, it's really, it's Christian Herder's invention, because you've got these brass sabots. These are these little kind of caps that go on the bottom of the feet. These brass corner plates. This is an element that's coming out of Chinese furniture, Ming period. Carves, tendrils, sort of floral tendrils that go up the legs, and these kind of pea pod motifs that spread across the seat rail. This kind of carved pea pod motif I could have shown you if I'd had more time to say everything I love about this stuff. I find first in the 1850s furniture of Gustav Herder, and here we're doing it Christian Herder again. So there's a firm vocabulary here. These are carved kind of loopy bows, carved out of solid wood. And I'm sorry to say I don't have a detail of the stretcher on the side, but one of these bows depends there and connects with 2 square links. And the links are connected to the legs by a carved band of fabric, if you will, that ends in a kind of lotus blossom suction cup that connects to the legs. And when you look at this detail, which is one of the most wonderful of all of late 19th century furniture, and the Europeans just go gaga over it. What's so remarkable about it is that, and you can find this all throughout Herder's furniture, but these forces of vertical and horizontal tension that lead the eye up and down and in and out and sideways, which makes it so visually rich and inventive. William H. Vanderbilt's library, where he spent most of his days until 1885, was sheathed in rosewood inset with mother of pearl, and you'll see in the center of the room his library table, which gratefully came to the Met's collection in 1972. Those were the days when, I don't think I'm not supposed to talk about prices, but I think it's so long ago I could say that it was $3,200 then. It's rosewood, this is inlaid, not marquetry, but inlaid with mother of pearl. And today, if I were to send it out alone, I probably would insure it for over $1 million. I don't think there's another one, although once I say that, there will turn out to be one. They once a good idea, they often. But I think Christian Herder took on this house by himself, and everything in it was really just for William H. There's so much about it that's sort of traditional and inventive. You see here these big carved paw feet with Ionic capital at the top, and this sort of engaged legs, this whole concept is really coming out of ancient Roman stone furniture. I could show you any number of examples in the Metz collection. But there the comparison ends. You have a sort of swath of fabric that's holding up this sort of carved acanthus motif. It in itself is kind of an aberration. But this idea of sort of wrapping a carved piece of fabric against the leg and tying it up into this lambrequin, this drapery motif with what looks like carved yarn here, these loopy bows. It's really quite extraordinary. It's a total invention of the designer. On either end of the table, you have two sides of the terrestrial globe inset in this mother of pearl, and then you have these mother of pearl plaques across the front, and of course, as her brothers always did, fabulous drawer pulls that are as beautiful as any piece of jewelry. On the top is a scattering of stars. I don't think I've brought you no, I didn't, the top, but just suffice it to say that the stars recreate the configuration of the constellations over the northern hemisphere on the day that William H. Vanderbilt was born in 1824. So he was, at the time, one of the richest, if not the richest men in the entire universe, and this kind of iconography obviously reflects that. So I close with this piece, which we had in the Herder show as well. We don't know from which commission. Again, very, very traditional in many respects. It's basically a box on stand. There are any number of important European precedents for it, 17th and 18th centuries. Inlaid with mother of pearl, it has its original silk velvet upholstery, luscious, thick, beveled glass and brass mullions. And this is a display cabinet again, something that you put in a drawing room and put your porcelains and your silver in. All sorts of inlaid mother of pearl at the top, baskets of flowers and festoons of various kinds, which connect this in terms of its decoration to motifs drawn from the 18th century, but again, recombined and reinvented in a whole new way. Here's a detail showing you that. Here are these very, it's sort of on the border of the Art Nouveau, which is going to become a force. It's very dangerous to say this age is something else, but it is rather like that. One would have to say it's these very stylized capitals. These are also an invention of the designer. Floral capitals now we've given up Ionic or Corinthian or anything else. Carved bows again, and a sort of strung pearl motif, very much part of the aesthetic of the 1870s and 80s. I'm convinced it comes out of Charles Garnier's Opera House in Paris, which is being built at the same time the interiors are being done in the 80s. And if you go in there now, you'll see that these sort of necklace motifs are absolutely everywhere. These inlaid, fabulous craftsmanship, these inlaid mother of pearl patterns, and these are 4 mixed metal plaques by Tiffany & Company, dated, for which the original drawings still exist. Above you can see these incredible gilt bronze sort of hinges that are, on one hand, sort of recalling hinges on a medieval strongbox, and the idea of this cabinet being something precious to hold something else that's precious is very much embedded in this type of imagery. But here, these tightly wound coils kind of threaten to unfurl into those curves that we see in the later 19th century in the form of the Art Nouveau. So with that, I close my remarks. I appreciate very much your patience, and I hope that I've managed to capture your interest a little bit for some of these later 19th century things. I hope you'll visit the Metropolitan, where we do have a very fine collection. I'm, of course, always happy to have friends from Stannington come down and to show you these things in person. This piece, of course, I wish were in the Met. It's not yet, but it's on my short list, and I hope to be successful in bringing it there eventually. I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you may have, or we can all break up and go to dinner. Anybody have questions? No, you're totally overwhelmed. Yeah.
I will.
The question I have on the floor is, about how New York presented itself, or what happened to it after the Civil War. See, I think after the Civil War, in terms of the arts, we refer to it as the Gilded Age, the so-called Gilded Age, the era of the robber barons, the railroad guys, the huge building that goes on all across the country, and the huge wealth and fortunes that were made during that era. I think what art in the Empire City showed us was that the stage was really set for that growth prior to the Civil War. I think people had always thought of all that growth and wealth and et cetera as being a post-Civil War phenomenon. But in fact, all of the players are in place. If it weren't for the Civil War, it all would have happened earlier, I think. Great fortunes were actually amassed before the Civil War, and the plans were all in everybody's heads. I mean, there was definitely, consciously and unconsciously, New York intended to be the center of all things in this country, and it was. But it's not, it just doesn't sort of happen starting in 1865. All of that is, and as you read, in great fits and starts in the decades earlier. So I think that is one of the contributions of the book, and I'm delighted that you're making your way through it. Anybody else? Yes, George?
Was Christian Herder in any way related to Christian Herder, who was Secretary of State during the...
Yes, it's all the same family. I think Christian Herder's Secretary of State is 2 generations down, I think. I think he's the son... I think he's the son of Christian Herder, the first son, Albert, who was an important artist in New York in the early 20th century. But yes, and they're still Herders today. But do they have one stick of Herder furniture? Did they go in for what I call the serious stuff? Yes. Oh well. So good. Bart is asking me to say something about the resources of the Metropolitan brought to bear in a show like Art in the Empire City. Well, it's really quite an extraordinary thing, I have to say. It's the first time I've been sort of solely in charge of a big project like this, and I saw it firsthand, the conservators and the installers and the designers and the graphic designers and the communications people and the education forces. It's really quite an extraordinary thing that the institution does for all of these projects. We spent, the idea for the show Art in the Empire City was cooking in the early 90s, but we spent a full 5 years in preparation for it. That is unusual. Normally a more typical schedule might be sort of 3 or 3.5 years. But knowing that the period had so little work done on it, that we would have to really get in there and dig out the period sources, I convinced my then boss, Jock Howitt, to give me a 5-year period, and believe me, we just barely made it. The period, the second quarter of the 19th century just had not been dealt with. We went through 90 periodicals, page by page. We did in-depth, there were hundreds and hundreds of newspapers, so we couldn't sort of do those page by page. There were dailies, weeklies, monthlies, etc. But we did target certain dates, and they were important to various objects in the show, and ferreted out more information that way. We read hundreds and hundreds of travelers' accounts. They were a wonderful source of people came, they were fascinated by New York, they all commented, many of them published their accounts of what they saw and what impressed them, and Broadway was always one of them. The Crystal Palace eventually was another one. So we did that sort of thing. It's just, there was a team. I was the project leader, there were 12 curators, a cultural historian, whose essay, I might add, by Del Upton, in the beginning of the book is really worth the price of the entire book. It was such a magnificent synopsis of this very complex period where there's something else is happening every 5 years. The city burns down, there's a huge economic crash, there's a new style in furniture, there's the advent of something else going on in painting, and it's just really, in terms of capturing what's going on, getting your arms around it, it was a big job. Del Upton is a professor of architectural history at Berkeley, whom I cajoled into working on this project gratefully, because it's really an extraordinary piece of work that he did. But he came and he walked every block in Lower Manhattan below 14th Street to see what of the old city was still there. And of all of us, including me, he was the only one who went through the 35 binders of periodical research and read everything. I mean, even I couldn't muster the time to do all of that. So a huge amount of research went into this. The Deswar furniture upholstery project took no less than 2 years to figure out what to put on. Because upholstery, if you think of it, is the other half of seating furniture, and it's been so long neglected. People are so fond of ripping stuff off, and if you have anything you think might be original, either under or over, under upholstery called the cake or the show cover, then leave it alone and let somebody who knows what they're doing look at it, because you lose a tremendous amount of information when that stuff gets ripped apart. And I should have said about the Dessoir, one of the great things about that suite, remember the Louis XIV with the green, is that the under upholstery is all intact. So we have an absolutely historically correct profile, which tells us a lot about what things look like. It must seem, for many of you, very esoteric, all what I do, but you know, somebody's got to do it, and it's a lot of fun. So we learned a tremendous amount from this show. We've set out benchmarks in all of our respective fields of dated and documented pieces, so that hopefully others can take this and then build out and do more concentrated focus exhibitions and books from that. Okay. That's Penny.
Follow up on his questions, but I was fascinated by the fabrics, and were the fabrics, did you have to order them, or did people like Scalamander, just for example, did they have anything in their archives that you could use, or did you have to go back to old Scalamander or whoever designs and get the fabrics?
It's just not that. No, we didn't have anything woven. We didn't have enough time, actually, to make up our minds what we wanted and get it woven. And we did, I mean, for example, Scalamander would have been one of the places we went, but there are a number of Hal Brunschwig and Old World weavers, and people. I had somebody in England researching fabric for the Dessoir. We could tell from the stuff that came out of the tack holes, and it's microscopic, but this is what they do these days, that it was a particular early version of a tapestry weave, something we don't think of seeing until the 1870s. We were clearly seeing it in the 1850s. Could we find a place that had a period tapestry weave? We knew from research that that sort of thing was being produced in northern France and in England. So we wrote to everybody in both places. Nobody's collected it, therefore you're out of luck on that front. So then I had somebody in England looking for, through all the V&A, all of the fabric weaving houses, archives. We worked closely with Prel in Lyon. They actually brought period silks from their archives for us to consider, because we were trying to get something that was period. Finally, we went a different route, and we decided to get something. It turned out to be off the rack. It was, I don't know, $100 a yard or something. It wasn't very expensive by the way these things go. I mean, a silk, to recreate a silk, can be thousands of dollars a yard. So we went with color, for which we had good sources for the period green. We went for something that kind of emulated that line drawing that we had, and we gave up on the tapestry weave entirely. And I should have pointed, well, if I'd had more time, I would have told you all of this at the time. And then there was the moment where we finally had the upholstery on the 3 pieces. It was a big job in and of itself, just to get the fabrics centered the right way and all of this. And then it's got to get photographed for the book. Oh dear, we need a trim. Oh dear. I mean, because a complex trim of, about that depth, and it's got to be a certain kind, and a certain kind of weave, and we've got all the period sources lined up, but where are you going to find it? And it's one of the many sweet stories that I could tell about my life in general, about my life at the Met in particular, and about this project. I have a very dear friend who's a furniture collector who lives in London. She periodically helps me with research. She swooped in and said, okay, I'll take on the trim. And we gave her the color swatches. We had all these other colors that are in this fabric, the sort of an orange and a blue and an ivory, all of which had been reflected in the tackles. She took these colors, threads, in her hot little hand and went off to the fabric houses. Didn't find anything, the days were marching by, and went ultimately to M&J Trimmings. Does everybody know what M&J Trimmings is? It's a discount leftovers place near the D&D building. And there she found this fabulous, you'll see it, you see it in the book, and the furniture isn't yet out on display because I have to make up space for it in the gallery. But anyway, it's the right size and depth and complexity and colors. Absolutely fantastic. And guess what? It's made of rayon. And guess what else? They had 58 yards, and 58 yards is what we needed around the front and the back of each piece. Isn't that just the nicest thing? Anyway, but a lot of effort went into upholstery for this show. I think we adjusted or reupholstered 11 pieces for the show. It was a huge project in itself. We have a brilliant upholstery conservator, but that's just one of many people who who put their all into bringing this to fruition. Anything else? It was a lot of fun. Thank you for having me come. Thank you for coming.